You think your secrets are safe because you can delete your browser history and block your ex on social media. But imagine living in a world where your most intimate betrayal wasn't just whispered about at dinner parties. It was carved into your flesh, branded onto your forehead, or sewn into a sack with a rabid dog before you were thrown into a freezing river to drown in absolute darkness. Throughout history, adultery wasn't treated as a private mistake or a relationship problem to work through with a therapist and some expensive wine. No, it was considered cosmic treason, an offense so vile that entire communities gathered in town squares with stones, torches, and whips to make sure the punishment was as public and humiliating as the crime was secret. And here's the truly delicious irony. While men who strayed might face a fine, a slap on the wrist, or at worst, a stern lecture from the local priest, this wasn't justice. This was theater. This was control wrapped in the language of morality, where the female body became a canvas for society's darkest obsessions with purity, ownership, and revenge. Let's start in medieval Germany, where they perfected the art of making death feel like drowning in your worst nightmare. Between the 13th and 16th centuries, if you were a married woman caught in bed with someone who wasn't your husband, congratulations. You just earned yourself a one-way ticket to the bottom of the nearest river, courtesy of a lovely little practice called sack drowning, or sackung if you want to sound fancy at your next execution. This wasn't some back-alley murder hidden from view. Oh no, this was law. This was codified in legal texts like the Sachsenspiegel and later the Carolina. Emperor Charles V's 1532 criminal code that basically said, yeah, go ahead and drown her, it's fine. We wrote it down and everything. The process was methodical, almost ceremonial in its cruelty. First, they debind the condemned woman as hands and feet so tightly that struggling would only tighten the knots and cut off circulation. Then came the sack, usually made of rough burlap or leather. And here's where it gets truly perverse. They didn't just toss her in alone. No, they'd add stones for weight, sure, but sometimes they'd throw in live animals. Dogs, cats, snakes if they were feeling particularly biblical. Imagine being sewn into suffocating darkness with a terrified animal clawing at you, both of you knowing you're about to die together in the coldest, most disorienting death imaginable. The officials would carry the sack to the riverbank, while crowds gathered to watch, and then splash. Into the water she went. A sack would sink slowly, giving her just enough time to feel the cold water seeping through the fabric, to hear the muffled roar of the river, to realize that no one was coming to save her. Drowning in a sack isn't quick. It's not like jumping into a pool and holding your breath until you black out. It's panic, confusion, the desperate animal instinct to breathe even when you know there's no air left. And the whole time, you're invisible, silenced, erased. The current would carry the sack downstream, sometimes for miles, until it snagged on rocks or washed up on some distant shore where no one knew your name. The body was rarely recovered for burial. You didn't get a funeral, didn't get prayers, didn't get a grave with your name on it. You became nothing, and that was the point. Medieval authorities believed drowning was a cleaner method of execution for women because it did unspill blood in the streets, which was considered unseemly and chaotic. But let's be clear, this wasn't mercy. This was erasure. This was taking a woman who had dared to act on her own desires, who had broken the sacred contract of male ownership, and literally making her disappear beneath the surface of the water where no one could hear her scream. The Sachsenspiegel, compiled by a man named Ike von Ripgau, described female adultery as a direct insult to the husband's honor, as if a woman's body was just another piece of property in the household inventory, right between the livestock and the furniture. Men who committed adultery, they got fined. They got publicly shamed. Sure, maybe had to stand in the town square for an afternoon while people threw rotten vegetables, but they lived. They went home. They had dinner. Women, on the other hand, were treated like contaminants, like moral pollution that needed to be scrubbed from the community. before it infected everyone else. And the sack drowning wasn't just about killing them. It was about making sure they disappeared completely, like they had never existed at all. But if you think drowning in a sack sounds bad, wait until you hear what happened when the authorities decided fire was a better purifier than water. In late medieval and early modern Europe, burning women alive wasn't just an execution method. It was a theological statement, a public spectacle, and a grotesque form of entertainment all rolled into one. By the 14th and 15th centuries, cities across France, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain were hosting burnings in town squares on market days because nothing says, "Come buy your bread and cheese," quite like watching a woman scream as flames consume her flesh. Adultery alone wasn't always enough to justify burning, but it was the perfect starting accusation. Once you were labeled an adulteress, it was shockingly easy to add a few more charges: witchcraft, heresy, unchaste living, whatever stuck. The Malleus Maleficarum, that delightful little manual published in 1487 and used to justify thousands of witch burnings, explicitly linked women's sexual transgressions to demonic influence. If you slept with a man who wasn't your husband, especially if he was of a lower social class or a different religion, congratulations, you are now a seductress, a threat to the moral fabric of society, possibly in league with Satan himself. And for that, you burned. The process was designed to maximize both suffering and spectacle. The condemned woman would be dressed in a plain shift, sometimes white, to symbolize the purity she had supposedly defiled, and marched through the streets to the town square where a wooden stake had been driven into the ground and, surrounded by bundles of dry wood straw and kindling, crowds gathered not reluctantly, not shamefully, but eagerly. Merchants closed their stalls. Mothers brought their children. Priests delivered sermons about sin and redemption, while the woman stood there, tied to the stake, waiting. The executioner had a choice at this point, and it was almost never a kind one. If he felt merciful, or if the family had bribed him, he might strangle the woman with a garrote before lighting the fire, giving her the mercy of dying from asphyxiation rather than burning alive. But mercy was rare. More often, the fire was lit while she was fully conscious, fully aware. Flames start at the feet, licking at the skin, blistering and blackening the flesh, while the brain is still screaming for the body to run, to escape, to do anything except stand there and burn. The smell of burning human flesh is sweet and sickening, like roasted pork, but wrong. Fundamentally wrong in a way that makes your stomach turn, even if you've never smelled it yourself. The woman's hair would catch fire, her screams would echo across the square, and the crowd would cheer, pray, or simply watch in silence as another lesson in female obedience was seared into public memory. This wasn't primitive savagery from some distant, barbaric past. This was law. This was policy. This was sanctioned by kings, approved by priests, recorded in meticulous detail in court documents that still exist today in archives across Europe. In Rouen, France, in 1431, the same year Joan of Arc was burned at the stake for heresy and cross-dressing, court records show multiple women executed by fire for vaguely defined moral transgressions that almost certainly included adultery. The fire was seen as a purifier, a way to cleanse not just the woman's soul, but the entire community of her corrupting influence. And the cruelty wasn't accidental. It was the entire point. The longer she suffered, the more effective the warning. The louder she screamed, the more people would remember. This was justice as performance art, where the female body was the stage and the flames were the final act.